Good morning and welcome to our webinar this morning. Is it safe to go back in the water? Thank you for joining us. This is one of a series of webinars we'll be running across the next 6 months, and we hope to give insight into some of the areas of the business and share some of our expertise and help people manage their buildings and comply with their current regulations. So before I hand over to our presenter, I'd like to do some housekeeping. On the right-hand side of your screen, you should be able to see a dashboard. There's a chat function on the dashboard. If you have any assistance or if there are any technical issues, if you drop a message into the chat box, we'll be able to help you. We'll be monitoring this and we'll be able to get back to you. You're currently, as attendees, in listen-only mode. This means that we cannot hear you, but hopefully you should be able to hear us. We'll be taking questions at the end of the seminar. Again, on the right-hand side of your screen, you should be able to see a question box. If you type any questions you wish to be answered into this box, we'll pass this along to our presenter and hopefully we'll be able to answer your questions at the end. If we have a number of questions coming in, we'll have a summary page and we'll send this out at the end of the seminar. You should also be able to see handouts. We currently have 3 handouts, which are all documents relating to the content for today's seminar. These can be downloaded in PDF format. Again, we'll be able to send these out at the end. We'll also be doing a follow-up survey, trying to get some feedback to see how you feel the seminar went, if it was useful, if there's any further questions or any interesting points that you would like some expansion on. I'd now like to hand over to our presenter, Dave Robertson. Dave's had 31 years experience in the water industry and will be able to answer all of your questions at the end. Thanks very much, Dave. I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and good morning, everyone. I'm delighted you can attend, and I hope your Friday morning will be well spent. I will add, although we've booked you out for an hour, it's Friday morning. I think we'll probably only talk for 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so. So let's start with a smile on our faces. Now, if you're a student of respiratory diseases in the UK, you've had an enormously challenging time this last 4 months. But there's one respiratory disease that's never gone away that I've been concerned with all my career, and that's Legionnaire's disease. And as we reopen buildings and start to repopulate them, this challenge is going to hit us head on. Today, what we'll do is we'll discuss some methods that will allow us to safely recommission water systems. And as we exit lockdown, we're going to need to really have a good look and assess our systems again to make sure they are safe to repopulate. Now, I have to say before we start, obviously all the industrial legislation that we're still working to, Health and Safety at Work Act, Management Health and Safety at Work regs, COSH, you name it, everything we've always been working to and to conform to has still been enforceable and is still being enforced by the HSE. In addition, the government have also issued other guidance notes such as SFG 20 and 30 on safe mothballing of buildings, and some of these have been updated as well. Now, depending on the type of building we have and the type of industry we're in, the requirements are going to be quite varied, and the investment involved in safely recommissioning them will be obviously appropriate to that risk. And very simple buildings, you can probably quite easily recommission just by a simple process of flushing. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. The more complicated buildings or more involved buildings probably will need a cleaning and disinfection procedure, or maybe even a repeat cleaning and disinfection procedure. Now, we are where we are because of COVID-19, and so we need to talk about this very briefly. But COVID-19 will increase the risk of Legionnaire's disease as a secondary infection. In Japan, I've come across recently a paper that hasn't even yet been published from a clinical trial to show that 20% of all patients who have been admitted to hospital with COVID-19 actually have Legionnaire's disease as well. We need to consider this when we're looking at the risk assessments for buildings. The symptoms of COVID-19 are very similar to Legionella. It's an influenza, flu-like disease. It's contracted via an aerosol. In the case of COVID, we're used to this 2-meter social distancing. Well, that's because the aerosol particles that could be exhaled are quite large, relatively heavy, and fall to ground sooner. You don't travel much further than 2 meters from a person. In the case of Legionella, again, spread via an aerosol, but Legionella, as I'm sure we all know, are much, much smaller particles, 3 to 5 micrometers, and these can travel actually in the air outside for many kilometers. So spread very similar way. The symptoms are very similar. Muscular aches, dry coughs, fatigue, headaches. Very, very difficult to, when you're studying Legionella, to know if it's flu or if it's actually a Legionella species. COVID-19 is not too dissimilar. Obviously, the testing for it is very specific. But generally, if you're at high risk of COVID-19 infection, you're going to be at high risk of Legionella infection too. They work the same way, and your lungs basically do not like these, get inflamed. So that's where we are at the moment. Okay, well, did anyone prepare for this? No, of course they didn't. And basically, we're in the position we're in because this came pretty much as a surprise. There was little planning for the shutdown, possibly inconsistent decisions on building closures themselves. Were we going to close completely? Were we going to stay partially open? Or were we going to stay fully open? There has definitely been a lack of resource in many buildings because some staff have been furloughed. Some are now working from home. So it's very difficult often to have the staff to actually close things down and protect ourselves and keep them managed in the position we're in. Now, a combination of these has led to a stagnation of water. Stagnant water to me means bacteria loves to grow. It'll grow very quickly. Water that's not moving, because it's a natural electrolyte, things will corrode. So we'll get lots of corrosion and rust within systems as well. Lots of nutrient for bacteria. And in larger systems, which could be dosed with an oxidizing biocide, for example, these oxidizing biocides can build up if there's no circulation, and these again can add to the corrosion potential and increase the load of suspended solids within the building. In addition to that, and we'll look at this more closely in a moment, it's been pretty warm. Buildings have got warmer. This obviously helps bacteria grow as well. Bear in mind, our shutdown started in March. At that time, heating systems were actually still probably running. Buildings are getting a thermal load that they wouldn't normally. Lots of modern buildings as well are have a lot of glass-sided, glass-fronted, and most of these windows don't even open. So they're cooled largely by air conditioning at the unit just above my head as I speak now. These aircon systems will probably have been turned off. Windows don't open, we don't get any ventilation. Again, the buildings have got warmer and hotter. So we've now got a position where we've had food and we have energy for the bacteria to grow. When we've looked at our risk assessments as well, we need to look at other things as well. It's not just the water distribution systems within it. There are other things going on within buildings. We may have humidifiers for climate controlled areas. Many buildings are going to have kitchens in them. These have got sprays. We have point of use water dispensers, water coolers, and even vending machines. All these things hopefully are within the scope of your existing Legionella risk assessments, but we need to look at all of these things. We're talking about recommissioning systems to make them safe for reoccupation. So the upshot of this is really, we need to really review your risk assessments. Conditions are different to they were 4 months ago. Let's look at this slide for a moment. This is from the Met Office, and it shows the last 30 years average temperatures between the beginning of March and the end of May. Now, our mean temperatures are this broken black line running through the center, which hopefully you can pick up on my mouse pointer. This dark blue line are the actual temperatures that have been recorded during this 3-month period. And it's fairly obvious we've been above our seasonal norm for almost the entire 3-month period. There's one obvious decline there in the middle of May, for the rest of the time, we've been well above. And in this particular period here, right in the center of essentially the first 2 weeks in April, we were consistently above. And at that point here, we were 7 or 8 degrees above the seasonal average norm for the last 30 years. So go back to my point about heat load in buildings. Things have been getting hotter, been getting warmer. So far we've got COVID-19, we've got climate change, and we've got Legionella all working as a deathly symbiosis. So we've got problems with stagnation of water, and we've got problems with things are getting hotter. These have increased our risk quite dramatically. So what would the solution be? Now, apologies for this slide if you're finding it difficult to see. It's been used from the Legionella Control Association and the Health and Safety Executive. We are providing links at the end of the seminar, so you will be able to have a look at this in a little bit more detail. This itself is not a risk assessment, I have to say that. But what it does do is it helps give us some guidance as to how we recommission systems and the size of systems and our particular actions that we need. It's worth stating that the solutions that we're going to talk through now could be a combination of 1, 2, or even 3 of these to make things properly safe. And our solutions, again, apologies if you can't read it, will be in these rhombus boxes here, the red boxes, the 2 red ones, and the yellow one in the center. And we have basically in order, flushing water from systems, testing, and cleaning and disinfection. So let's have a look at flushing first of all. There's a little factoid on the slide there, which perhaps if you can look at, just file that away for a couple of seconds. So firstly, why do we actually flush water from systems? Let's go back to the beginning. Well, basically by doing this, we're looking to purge water through the system to move stagnant, often warmer water, if it's a cold water supply, through to the outlet, through the pipework, bringing fresh water to the fittings. In the case of hot water, when we flush them, we're bringing the warmer water that's cooled within the pipework and the head, the tap or the shower head or whatever, through and bringing hotter water that should have thermally disinfected Legionella to the end of the tap. The risk is not just from the outlet itself and what grows in it, but it's actually the bulk water. So thereby flushing it, we can move these things along. And you can clearly see on the slide, if we took a water sample and analyzed it straight off, turning the tap on, that's a sort of level of infection may be typical. After 1 minute, we test down to the central picture, and after 2 minutes, a huge log reduction. That's possibly a log 3 or log 4 scale reduction in the bacteria within the pipework. That's why we flush. Now, there are 2 different types of flushing, and the BSI document 855468, and I won't give it its full name again, it's too long, makes a distinction between hygiene flushing and cleansing flushing. Now, the hygiene flush would be this type of flush we see on here, a 2-minute flush. This is probably the type of flush that we're familiar with doing in little used outlets or from dead legs or dead ends. This maintains a stable water temperature through that pipe network. This is, again, what would be a normal weekly practice in normal conditions. Now, BSI recommend, however, we do a cleansing flush. Well, this is a far more complete discharge and flush of the tap, probably running the tap at something like 50% bore for a minimum of 5 minutes. This should be more representative of a normal typical usage within an outlet, but again, we should be looking now at doing this on a weekly basis from our sentinel outlets. Instead of a hygiene flush, give it a longer 5-minute, 50% bore flush. Now, a cleansing flush will move what's called biofilm. It's a great phrase that water treatment people throw around. Biofilm is this small slimy layer that forms within pipework and in water fittings, and it's a degree of everything. It's suspended solids, it's dead bacteria, algae and slimes, very thin, monomolecular normally within pipework. And these tend to build up. And Legionella can grow within these and underneath these. Often biofilms are great protection for Legionella. If we flush in a cleansing type flush, often that volume of water is enough to shear biofilms off pipework, which is what we want. We want to get all that out of the pipework, move it through. This will also move other contaminants such as suspended solids through. Now, ironically, we're actually in a position in many buildings whereby we've had energy saving and environmentally safe and friendly taps and fittings put in. And these tend to slow up the flow of water through them, mix more air in, create more aerosol, precisely what we're trying not to do. Now, these tend to slow the flow of water up through the pipe. And so if we're doing a cleansing flush, BSI and the HSC would recommend that we actually take these flow restrictors and flow straighteners out of our fittings, allow the water to flow at the velocity that our pipework should allow it to do. Now, despite cleansing flushes, this 5-minute flush minimum will never really replicate a normal usage of water within a system. And if you remember that little factoid, buildings are designed so that typically each person in them will consume about 50 litres of water a day. That's not just in drinking teas and coffees, by the way, that's flushing taps, flushing toilets, what you may use in a kitchen, etc., etc. 50 litres, 10, 11 gallons in old money, it's quite a lot of water. So if you consider a building that would normally have 20 people in it, you'd have a water system designed to hold a ton of water, 1,000 litres of water. Well, we're never going to flush 1,000 litres of water a day from a building that's not occupied. So when we do flush, we've got to consider whether we're flushing enough. So let's get onto this cleansing flush, 5-minute flush. Do note the temperature of the hot water coming back when we're cleansing, flushing the hot water system, the temperature coming back to the calorifier. And where we've got dead legs and blind ends have been identified in your risk assessment, do make sure that these are properly cleansed and flushed. Now, an example that I'll refer to now, and we'll come back to it later, is the gym that we look after. It's been closed for 3 months, since the middle of March, 3.5 months, in fact. And it's brought the water system from what is a fairly low risk, and it's moved it to a considerably higher risk. Still not a high risk, because the water storage is fairly small, but it's a higher risk. And the first control measure that we've instructed the client to use, and we've been working with them on this, is to do a cleansing flush. So that system is flushed for 5 minutes, hot and cold, 50% bore of the outlets every week. We've done some testing on that, and we've had low TVC counts and good Legionella-free results. So we're pretty sure we've verified that this flushing regime is working. Now, for low-risk systems, as I mentioned earlier, and I won't read this out because it's fairly straightforward to read, if your water system within the building falls within this sort of category as defined by the HSC, it's low risk. And quite probably, cleansing flushing will be sufficient to keep control. And this will be okay to have been doing this during lockdown and to continue to do this during recommissioning. More complicated systems, and of course that's probably the vast majority out there, as recommended by the European study groups and the Society for Prevention of Public Health and LCA, HSC, all the bodies, we recommend going beyond this, however. This is just strategy one. And my friend, the director of the World Health Organization, would say, test, test, test. Obviously that's for COVID, but as our second control measure, we're talking about water sampling and water testing. This is a fairly cheap and it's a pretty flexible method of keeping control on systems. The one slight problem with this is when we take a Legionella, TVC, Pseudomonas sample, we could be waiting for up to 2 weeks to get a result back. The one assistance with that is most UCAS labs will look at the slides on the cultures and examine them after 3, 5, 7, and 9 days. And at the 10th day, that's our final read. So any samples that look as if they could be out of compliance, most water treatment companies will get an interim alert from their UCAS laboratories. Now, we work significantly and very closely with a number of academic sites. Now, these range from schools, secondary schools and primary schools, colleges of further education, sixth form colleges, universities. These have a huge, extensive property portfolio, and these largely have been completely empty since the end of March. So we're now in a situation where we have many clients with large numbers of properties, all with stored water, or with stagnant stored water. And this covers things like faculty buildings, concert halls, canteens, bars, administration buildings, and other general buildings as well. We've got a lot of empty buildings. Now, normally outside of term time, further education places will host conventions, summer schools, and what have you. It's very rare they're not being used and water is not being turned over within them. But as we've stated and seen, we've had 3 months of really hot weather, and we've had 3 months of totally empty buildings. I'd like to share this graph with you because I don't think anybody's really looked at this before. But following on from what I've just said, this is an example of the number of tests, water tests. So that's TVC, total viable count, Pseudomonas, Legionella tests, maybe any other form of water test as well, to be honest with you, on water hygiene and bacteria that we've taken this year. These are the orange columns here from January to the end of May. The blue columns are the corresponding tests we took on the same months of last year. We've had a colossal step change. We've had an 800% increase in the sampling because this is our second recommended control method. It's a fairly cheap and economical solution to enforce and to carry out. But what we've seen is if you look at the yellow line and the right-hand column here, these are our percentage failures. Last year, we were running, well, significantly under 2% failure rate. That's outside of control parameters, not just positive Legionella, that could be excessive TVCs, that could be presence of Pseudomonas aeruginosa, that could be whatever it is, but results that are outside of specification. The grey line here are the current number of failures we're getting. Again, on the same scale, we're running at just under 12% failure rate. These are just in the academic sector. So these are buildings that I said that have been largely unused for 3.5 months. We're running at a failure rate of 1 in 8. So this backs up what we've said. And it was fascinating to me to put this together. We knew we were getting increased failure rate, but to sit down and actually analyze the results was a real eye-opener. The great thing with testing is you can be very specific where you test. You can isolate your high-risk areas and really zoom in. You can test at the outlets, you can test at other points, and you can test off the calorifiers. We can really zoom down and identify where our problems are. Now, the HSE, there's a phrase that's thrown out a lot called validation testing. Now, this is really important, and it'll probably bring us to our final control measure. Cleaning and disinfection. I'm sure everybody watching today is familiar with this and you will have gone through it in the past. This is always the gold standard, the final solution, if you like, the reach for the bleach. So we've got 2 controls, that's flushing, cleansing and hygiene flushing, and testing. But where these show that we've got a problem, and 12% of our academic clients show we've got a problem, we need to do something else. So we have to clean and disinfect. We've been 3 months in lockdown though. Anybody with a slightly more complicated system other than the low risk systems we showed, I would recommend we clean and disinfect. I don't think there's any other way, to be honest with you guys. And most responsible companies would say exactly the same. Now, one good thing about lockdown is it enables us to do more regular tank inspections. Normally, you'd only inspect once or twice a year tanks, but because of the 3 months or so, I've been inspecting all the tanks I've been looking after on a monthly cycle. The gym we mentioned earlier, we've got 2 pictures here. These are one of the tanks supplying. This picture was taken in January. See the ball valve at the bottom there, and the one on the right-hand side was taken 2 weeks ago. As you can see, there's a little bit of sediment buildup on the wall of the tank and on the base. The good thing for me is the water looks clean, sharp, and crystal clear. But obviously you can see a buildup of sediment within there. So my recommendation is going to be with this client, we've tested it, we've flushed it. When it's going to be brought back into use, it needs to be cleaned and disinfected. Now the validation sampling I was talking about earlier is this. We take a sample before we clean and disinfect. That's our baseline sample. We know where we are with that. After the disinfection, we flush the system again. Now we take another sample with that tap insert removed or the flow straightener, flow restrictor removed. We want to sample the body of water. We don't want to sample the outlet especially. If the outlet's dirty, that can be cleaned. But we don't want to check the outlet and have that potentially contaminate our water sample. We want to just test the bulk water. Now the validation sample is that this should be done between 2 and 7 days after the clean and disinfection. Not immediately after, not after dechlorinization of the system, but 2 to 7 days. This eliminates any possibility of false negatives in the system. After that, go back to a system of regular flushing. And I would say until it's fully occupied, use a cleansing flush protocol rather than a hygiene flush. There's one other area that we can look at as well, and this is pertinent because we have a number of clients who are hotels. Now, many of these people furloughed their staff straight away. There's been nobody in them at all to flush at all. The issue we have there is how do you safely recommission that? Well, yes, we can clean and disinfect, but you can also thermally sterilize, as I'm sure everybody knows. But to do this, we'd have to ensure your boiler could get the water hot enough, and we need to raise the water to around about 70 degrees within the system and get it to 65 degrees at the outlets. And we need to hold it at that temperature for 1 hour. You obviously have to test that temperature at the outlets for 1 hour. You don't keep the taps running, but you purge and flush enough water through to ensure we've got 65 degrees from outlet here to outlet Z. That's a thermal disinfection. After that, we'll do our validation testing 2 to 7 days again. Well, thanks everyone. That probably concludes what I want to talk about. We've looked at 3 strategies: flushing, testing, and cleaning and disinfection. And in many cases, we're going to use 1, 2, or all 3 of these strategies. Now, despite the comical slide, I've got to say we've been in really, really strange times recently. I've never experienced anything like this in my entire working career, and I'm sure everybody's the same. And building managers have got some very interesting questions facing them when they come back in. It's certainly possible that many workers could be encouraged to work from home in the future. And it's certainly possible that different working practices are going to be evolved in the next few months as we socially distance. The upshot of that is there are going to be probably fewer people working in our workplaces than there were at the turn of the year. Now, there are environmental benefits to that, and as a commuter, it's been great this last few months. The roads have been really quiet. They're getting busier now, though. But I'm sure employers have appreciated that many businesses are just as productive with people working from home as they are with working in a central office space. If you add to that the fact that people working from home don't put stress on that office, they don't use the water, they don't use the power, they don't use the broadband, then I think many employers are going to be looking at really altering some working practices quite dramatically. If that is the case, that means there'll be less people within buildings to actually use the water. And so many water tanks that were designed for, say, 50 people, 100 people in a building, could now be experiencing 20, 30, 40 people on different days of the week. different times of the year, different months. There's going to be a large impact. And again, to go back to something I said at the beginning, when we review our risk assessments, and I stress we really need to be looking at these now, there are going to be some very interesting knock-ons. As we exit lockdown, some of us have exited it far quicker than others, those across the bridge. We're going to be faced with another potential business risk, and that is Legionella. But if we follow the 3 solutions of cleaning, testing, and flushing, I think we'll get to a position where we will be safe to go back in the water. So thank you for allowing me to speak with you this morning. It has been a pleasure. And I'll hand you back to Rachel now. And Rachel can do a good MC job and handle some questions, which I'll be delighted to answer. So thank you.
Thanks, Dave. That was really, really informative. So I think on behalf of myself and the audience today, I'd like to thank you and the team for the work that you've put in making the webinar and presenting today and making it so interesting. I particularly enjoyed the draw slide at the end, which was a bit of a surprise. So we've got some questions that have come in. So if you wouldn't mind having a look at these and answering them, I will read them out. Hopefully they will be quite straightforward.
Fire away.
Okay, so the first one from Jessica Abraham. If my building is going to be shut for months, is there any harm in only flushing, testing, etc. at the end of that period at the point of reopening?
If it's been shut for months, in a perfect world, we should be flushing on a regular basis. It's as simple as that. We need to be drawing water through the systems. The longer the water's stagnant and the warmer the building is, potentially the worse risk we're under. Biofilm grows really quickly. I've done a lot of work in dental surgeries, bizarrely, over the years, and some of it has shown that biofilm that I talked about can actually grow down dental lines in warm buildings up to 12 inches per day. That's a phenomenal rate of growth. So leaving things idle isn't really ideal. If there are no managers in the building and there really isn't anybody to occupy the building, then really we're probably faced with, well, we don't have many other choices. So I would recommend really, if that has been the case and the building's been idle, give it a very, very good cleansing flush firstly, and then I would go straight for a clean and disinfection. Because if you've been leaving things idle, there is no guarantee what's been going on within the pipework, within hot water systems, within calorifiers, within the tanks themselves.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, this question is coming from Derek. There is no stored water on the site and they have a low risk system. Does chlorination apply in this circumstance?
Probably not. If you're definitely fall within that low risk category, and you know at the end of the day your Legionella risk assessment has done that, it will assess your level of risk, and it is a low risk, then I would say no. If you followed the protocol of flushing, that's a cleansing flush rather than a hygiene flush, HSC would say that probably is enough. But I would probably suggest as a good belt and braces, have some Legionella tests and some TVC tests done as well. So we're using two strategies rather than the one. You can disinfect, of course. You can do a mains disinfection, but water supplied to your tap in a low risk outlet is assumed to be good, wholesome, and of fine quality, basically. So I think a regular flushing regime allied to 1 or 2 tests would probably be enough for Derek.
Okay, thank you very much. A question from Maria Hart. Do small businesses know they need to do this process? How can they be informed? I think, is there any information out there that we can direct Maria to, or we would provide to small businesses?
I would probably say that's a good question. I would probably say, I mean, we're going to supply some links on the end of the slides as well. I mean, our governing body, for want of a better expression, but the body that we're members of, and the vast majority of water treatment companies are members of, is the Legionella Control Association, the LCA. And I would say your best advice really is to look at their website, and we'll supply the link and take it from there, because there is good advice for building owners, for businesses, and also for water treatment companies as well. And I think that's probably your best starter for 10, to be honest with you. You can have a look at the HSC website as well, but the HSC website is more teaching the informed, I would say, rather than the LCA. The LCA is really very good basic guidance, but with some very, very well-reasoned guidance on there. And from there, you can go off to wherever you need to go off. But I think that's probably your best starting point.
Okay, I think that's answered the question. Maria, we can send that information on to you.
Yeah.
I think we're also looking at publishing the webinar as well, as this has been recorded. So if there are any links that we can provide, then you can send those out to any colleagues or any businesses. So I think we've got the last question that we've come to today from Warren Jones. If we end up in lockdown again in the winter, would there be any changes to your recommended regime you've talked about today, Dave?
Another lockdown. #2.
Christmas lockdown, I think.
Well, I think basically our three strategies are still going to remain the same. I mean, at the end of the day, we've got to try and mimic a water usage. We've got to try and get water moving through the buildings. We need to test it to make sure it's clean, and ultimately cleaning and disinfection is I won't say the nuclear option, that makes it sound drastic, but it's our go-to option, because water doesn't like being stagnant. Things will happen, things will grow in it, and we as a race, as a species, do not like being subject to stagnant, warm water with things growing in it. We need to keep them clean. So if we do go through a lockdown, then no, I think we're really going to have to do the same things again. The one proviso to that is, if it is winter, it should be colder. I know it generally doesn't tend to get cold till about January, but buildings should actually retain a little bit less heat. So there may not be any growth of bacteria, may not be quite as extreme as we've seen in the last 3 or 4 months.
Okay, so it's just one final question that has come in from Sarah. We will be having less people in our building. What would Dave suggest is a suitable course of action to manage the risk if there are less people? So the building is still occupied.
Right.
Less
I don't know what building is or what the business is, but at the risk of sounding boring, Sarah, have a look at the risk assessment. That's your starter. That's got to be our starting document. That's a legal requirement. You've got to have one anyway. Review it. Definitely review it. If there are less people in, then your risk profile has obviously changed, because there's less demand, there's less turnover. It could well be the water system is grossly oversized. Could well be it's still the right size. You may look at doing things like changing the number of outlets, reducing the number of taps that can be used, taking things out of service, downsizing the water storage as well to make sure it turns over more regularly. We should be looking at a 24-hour cycle turnover of cold water within a water tank. We obviously haven't had anything like that recently, but that's the thing you have to look at in a risk assessment. Is there sufficient demand on that water to ensure that enough water is cycled over through that tank, one complete refill and empty in 24 hours? So firstly, risk assessment, but that actually physically might mean get up there and actually start looking at some things as well.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's all of the questions that have come in today. So again, thank you very, very much, Dave, for this morning. And thank you to all of our attendees. I hope you've enjoyed the session. We will be sending out a follow-up information pack and a questionnaire just to see if we can identify the information that you found useful. We can also send out some follow-up information. So some of the questions that come in, we can provide additional guidance on where to look or advice as needed. So I think that concludes us for today. I hope you have a lovely Friday and enjoy the weekend. I hope it's a bit drier than it has been this week for everyone. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.